Yeah, my take is a little bit different from what Ben just offered. It's not really my take though. It reflects work that Stuart Soroka of the University of Michigan and I have been doing for 15 years or so. It's been a long time, Stuart. Also, a more recent work with Peter Enns of Cornell University and also a graduate student at the University of Texas, Alex Branham. And so I'll be talking about this. It's not really me, it's us. So I think the big question here is, how can we tell? I think is the question I think we'd ask is, how can we tell if there's inequality of representation? And there's a simple kind of, it seems kind of simple, right? We just look at this equation. And this is a very, very bare bones equation, right? So what we have here is a P, nice simple policy, as a function of different O's, right? There's where O is just public opinion. And there's some superscripts there. I think they're P for poor, M for middle, and R for rich. But we could do any group, right? We could, any kind of groups. We could do gender, we could do race, we could do anything, right? Where we have measures. And you can think of the units as pretty much anything. We can think of it being issues. We can think of space, different states, different countries. We can think of time. We can think of all three. So you could have issues across space and across time, which would be kind of, I guess, ideal for those of us who do this kind of work. And this approach really allows an assessment of responsiveness. I'm happy to get into this discussion about responsiveness and congruence because I think it's really, really important. I really thank Ben for getting into it. And that is the point is with this kind of analysis will allow us to see whether one coefficient is bigger than another and how much bigger it is, right? Whether they're more responsive, for instance, to those people with high incomes versus those people with middle incomes or those people with low incomes. But we also might be able to get a little glimmer of insight into congruence as well. And we'll talk about that. Okay, so and this is a point that Ben has touched upon already. Stuart and I have touched upon many, many times now in print, and basically the importance of differences and preferences. And Ben emphasized the importance of differences and preferences across groups, whatever groups we're looking at, for the detection of differential responsiveness. It's just impossible, right, to identify whether policymakers are responding to one group or another. Preferences are identical, and also it becomes difficult to the extent they are identical, right? The closer they get, more difficult it is. In some sense, I think, and more importantly maybe, is the consequences of differential responsiveness are also, right, affected by difference, right? If there is no difference, then whether one responds, one reflects or responds to or follows one group or another really just doesn't make any difference. And this is not all we're going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about today, but I want to talk about both difference, but also the consequence, the responsiveness, the difference, and also the degree to which what we can gather about congruence as well. And so what I'm going to start off with is a little discussion of differences itself, right? Difference itself, and I'm going to talk about spending preferences, tax preferences, looking at Jim Stimson's mood variable, which I'm guessing most of you know about, and then the Wlezien page data itself, which will probably take up most of my time because it's so interesting. It's such a wonderful data set. Okay, so I'm going to start with a slide here. This contains a summary of spending preferences in a number of domains. Can you see this pretty clearly? You can see it more clearly than I can, I think. But basically, these are responses to questions asking questions that ask, do you think the government is spending too much, too little, or about the right amount on different things, healthcare, defense, crime, education, the environment, and welfare? And they're all reflected here. And these are, what we've done here is calculate the net support, those basically saying too little minus those saying too much. So it's a net support for more spending. And these are means calculated for the lower tercile, income tercile, the bottom third of the distribution, the middle third of the distribution, the top third of the distribution as well, with the white bar being the low, the black bar being the middle, and the gray bar being the high. If you can see on the left-hand side, we have crime, and then defense, education, health, environment, and welfare. And what you can see pretty clearly from this is, and the scale, right, the y-axis runs from 100 to minus 100 because in theory that is the full range, right? So everybody says they want more. we would get 100. If everybody says they want less, we get minus 100. And what we see here is a striking amount of similarity. I mean, if you look at the crime, there's not a whole lot of difference here. I mean, it's imperceptible in most offense, education, health, environment. Maybe there's a little something. And the real difference we get here is in welfare. And you can see that there where there's the net support for more spending is close to zero in the case of people with low incomes, and much lower, right, for those people with middle and high incomes, precisely maybe as many of us would expect. Importantly here, though, as you'll notice, is there's a big similarity. The difference is, for the most part, between the rich and the middle on the one hand and the poor on the other. And that's going to be a recurring theme here. And has been a recurring theme in our work, and it'll be a recurring theme in my discussion today. Here's a zooming in on the average. These averages are calculated over time periods from 1973 to 2014. And what I'm showing you here is preferences, or our preferences for welfare spending for low income, middle income. Again, it's net support, low income, middle income, and high income over time. And what you'll see here are two things, I think, is one, the striking amount of similarity of the difference. And this is why this data, I think, is so neat and so useful, is it's not just an artifact of, we're not just finding a difference in 1973 or a difference in 1982 or 1995. We're finding a consistent difference here. And it's a consistent difference, again, between the poor on the one hand and the middle and the rich on the other. And if there's anything, if you notice anything about this graph, it's that, in addition to what I just said, is that there's a convergence between the middle and the rich. They become increasingly alike over the time period here in this figure. Also, it's really one thing that I think you might find interesting as well is you saw that in the last figure I presented, that the low income preferences are closest to zero. And some people have suggested that these relative preferences, these preferences for more or less, tell us something about congruence, right? And so if the mean preference of a group is zero, that means they're pretty happy, right? If it's positive, well, they want more. If it's negative, they want less. And so if it's zero, the average person in that group is content. They're satisfied, right? Interestingly, to the extent you buy that interpretation, this is an interpretation that Larry Bartels advances. It's an interpretation that Jim Stimson sort of implicitly adopts in his characterization of conflicted conservatives, right? Those who call themselves conservatives, but take these liberal policy positions, right? They want more, they want more. So if you take that interpretation, the low-income people are best represented. They're most satisfied. They least want a change from the policy status quo. I'm not saying you should buy that interpretation. I'm just noting that. Let's look at another policy domain. This is taxes. You see a very, very similar pattern to what I just showed you with welfare. This is a question. It bounces around a little more, and I think it's because of the question, which asks about an individual's own taxes, right? It says, do you consider the amount of federal income tax which you have to pay is too high, about right, or too low? And here you see the high income, the middle income, again, trafficking together, and also converging, at least a little bit, although the convergence seems to be less pronounced by comparison with welfare, and the low income different. Striking amount of difference and a striking amount of parallelism as well. So consistent difference. Maybe not as much as on welfare, but still there. These are specific items. Maybe there's something about spending. Maybe there's something about taxes. This is not all of what the government does. Another take we could, and something else we could try, as I've hinted in the first slide, is that we could look at summary measures, other policy areas, and Jim Stimson has provided this really ingenious summary measure of public opinion across a whole range of policies, which is called policy mood. And what we can do is do the same thing we did for spending and taxes and calculate preferences by tercile, mood by tercile, and that's what this does here. And you find something, again, pretty similar, right? You find the middle and the rich trafficking together, offset from the poor, and again, slightly greater convergence between the middle and the rich, right? So to the extent there's a difference, it may have widened, actually, right? Between the poor on the one hand and the middle and the rich on the other. Why is this interesting? Why is this important? Well, what Stuart and I have emphasized on repeatedly, I'm not sure to what effect, is that there are really strong theories for representing the median voter, right? There are really, really strong theories for representing the rich, right, or people who have higher incomes, right? And there's a variety of theories for that. There are not really, really equally strong theories for representing the poor. I mean, it's not to say we shouldn't represent the poor, and we shouldn't care if they're not represented, but we have really, really strong theoretical bases, expectations about the middle and the rich, and there's not a whole lot of difference. at least based on these measures. Just the scale. The scale here is a little bit more difficult, I think, to interpret, and because this is a creation, right? This is a man-made measure, and so I just want to give you to give you a sense for what that difference actually means. So there's a difference between the poor, middle, rich. How much difference is there really there? Here's the difference you get when you do the same calculation by party identification over time. And I don't think it takes you a whole lot. The scale, the range, the scale is 5 points off, but it's an intercept, so it's the range of the y-axis is exactly the same. You could get a sense there. So yeah, there's differences here. But one thing I'm going to mention to you at the end, again, that we've repeatedly emphasized, one of the things that's really, really important here is why isn't there more difference? And here, and here. That may be one of the most interesting questions, in addition to the question I think that Ben left on the table at the end, which we have as well. Okay, to what extent do these differences measure or matter? We've done the same kind of analyses that Ben just showed you. This is from a paper chapter published in a volume that Peter Enns and I produced. This is a Stuart in my paper. And what we did here is basically the same exact kind of analysis. We didn't have, there not a whole bunch of other independent variables, which really, in one sense, complicate the assessment because they could mediate the effects of opinion, right? So what we did here is basically say for each one of these domains, this is over time, we have spending as a dependent variable, change in spending as a function of low-income preferences, middle-income preferences, and high-income preferences. Again, defense, welfare, health, education, environment, crime, and then I give you the median coefficient and the mean coefficient on the right, in the right-hand column. And what you can see here is a lot of variety, right? I mean, is there a clear pattern here? Not to me. I mean, on defense, where we know public opinion, if we do an F test on those three, or the collective effects of those three, there's a big significant effect. Public opinion matters. But is it the rich? Well, maybe a little bit more, but not reliably so. On welfare, the middle are winning, right? On health, the poor. At education, well, looks like maybe the middle, but not reliably, right? Not significantly. There's the rich on the environment, and maybe they and the poor together are influencing things on crime. If you look at the averages, the middle and the rich are doing about the same, better, and the poor are not doing so well. So there's not a clear story here. What's the bottom line? Just not clear. The Gillens and Page data offer us some other insight and really fantastic data set. And cheers to Marty. Ben, I'm giving you credit for the data as well. Hope that's okay. Just want to clarify what this data is, just so you know, because it's relevant to what I'm going to talk about, what Stuart and I and Alex Branham have done with it. Which is, what they do is they have these dichotomies. Do you favor this policy change or do you oppose it? So it's in one sense, a very clear, absolute preference, indeed a preferred policy change. Do you want the change or don't you want the change, pro or con? And they match it up with the actual corresponding policy change, okay, whether it happened or not. And not really partially. There's a lot here to go into. So what this allows us actually to do is to assess congruence, right, between policy decisions and preferences across income groups. At least an insight, a type of congruence. It's not really the policy they want and what they're getting, but a preference for a particular policy and whether they get that policy. And I'm happy to get into that later on, because they may want something different, right? Okay, but before I do that, let's look at policy preferences themselves. And here, this is, can you see that? Does that look reasonably three-dimensional? It does, okay. This is plotting on three axes, low income, middle income, and high income, right? And it's plotting the preferences, right, for low, middle, and high income across these 1,779 policies that Ben already mentioned. Again, these are 1981 to 2002. Again, these are the 10th percentile, 50th percentile, 90th percentile. And there's one heck of a channel there, isn't there? I mean, these are not all over the map, right? So when the rich and the middle, when the rich want something, the middle and the poor tend to want it. And when they don't, they don't. And here I'll show you. Here's where there's where the majorities of all three are in agreement. Let's add in where they're opposed. And here's the ones where there's differences, right? Where one group is disagreeing with two other groups. These are really, this is less than 20% of the cases, so over 80% of the cases we have agreement across the 10th, 50th, and 90th percentile. Again, to underscore the, what is that what's going on there, right? Those are the preferences, right? Maybe they don't make sense. Maybe they do. I mean, I'm not judging, but it's a question. The main focus of the Page and Gillen's paper is on the high and the middle income groups, right? And here you are just plotting those two. And you can see a pretty good relationship there. Again, the correlation is 0.94. The green dots are the ones where policies passed, and the red where they didn't pass. And so you can see not only a nice correlation, you can see the more green dots up on the upper right-hand corner, as you'd expect. This is where the middle and the rich are both supportive, right? And a little more red dots on the lower left-hand corner when the middle and the rich are both opposed. Okay. There's the breakdown. So it's what the rich and the middle both oppose 616 times. They both favor 978 times. There's 185 times in which they disagree. That's just about 11% of the cases. So in 89% of the cases, they're in agreement. Those are the cases, right, highlighted. Okay, so the rich is along the left hand, the 90th percentile is on the y-axis, and the middle income on the x-axis. So if the rich are winning all the time, right, what would we see? We see a bunch of greens here above the line, right? And what we see, a bunch of reds below the line. And instead, what do we see? A mix of greens and reds above and a mix of greens and reds below. One thing I want to point out is going to become relevant later is if you'll notice, difference is greater here than it is in the rest of the distribution. That the difference in opinion between the middle and the rich, here, for the whole distribution, it's less than 6 points. That's the average difference between the middle and the rich. Here, it's 11 almost, right? For the rest of them that are not there, the ones where they agree, it's about 5. Okay? So again, there's not a lot of difference, but there's more difference where they disagree. This becomes important as we move on. So what about policy success when the high and middle income groups disagree? Okay, so you get, to get a nice simple, you can see there's the middle favor in the first column, the rich favor in the second column, the total wins in the third column, and you get the win rate with the middle win in the first row and the rich win, and you see it's a 47-53 split. For those of you who are statistically oriented, that's not significantly different from 50-50. Okay, so there's basically, it's a coin flip as to whether the rich or the middle win. Now, you might one problem with this kind of analysis is we're lumping together policies where rich favor and rich oppose, right? And you got to take into account those differences. And if you look at those, the win rates going down, right? In the bottom of the bottom row, it's the win rate for the middle. Where they favor the policy. In the second column, it's the win rates of the rich where they favor the policy. And you can see here you're looking at 26 and 37%. There's a difference here, and it's a wider difference than the overall win rates would suggest, right? But the point here is this is to echo something that Ben has already raised, but not only about the middle lose a lot and the rich lose a lot, right? This is not a story about one group. I mean, the rich do a little better. But it doesn't look like dominance. It doesn't look like oligarchy to us. Okay. Well, maybe this just taking difference is not the right way to do it because there's little differences in there and big differences. And so we use the standard that Marty Gillen's employed in his book, 10 points, keeping in mind that 10 points is double the difference where the groups agree. So this is a pretty high bar, right? So when you employ it to these 185 cases, you're left with 101 cases now. And what you see is the rich do a little better. Again, they do better. They do better than the middle, and they do, but not. They don't get 50%. They don't dominate. It's not oligarchy. But it's important, right? Taking these kinds of things into account. If you apply the standard to the groups, the policies where the rich and the middle agree, but either in favor or against, if you apply the 10% bar, you end up with 12.5, 13% of all the other policies. So here you're holding on to about 60%. Of the other ones, you only hold on about 12 or 13%. So you lose a lot. Again, because there's not a whole lot of difference in preferences when they're on the same side, right? Either in favor or opposed. Okay, so let's bring the poor back in. This is not a story. While we may have weaker theoretical expectations about representing the poor, it's important and it's interesting. And what we map here is on the left frame, it's the support for the 90th percentile on the y-axis and the 10th percentile on the x-axis. In the right frame, it's the 90th, it's 50th percentile, sorry, and the 10th percentile. And this is not surprising. The right frame looks a lot more like what we saw when we mapped the 90th percentile and the 50th, right? So the 10th and the 50th are more similar than the 10th and the 90th, and the 50th are in the 90th also. And you'll notice also, by comparison with the earlier slide I showed you, there tend to be more green dots above the line, right, and more red dots below, right? So, it looks like the poor aren't doing as well, right, against either the middle or the rich. But here's what I find an interesting summary. This is support basically across all combinations of groups, right? So you have policies where none of the groups are in favor. That's the top row here. You have the bottom row where all of them are in favor. Again, those two account for over 80% of the cases. And then you have everything else in between. Just where the poor favor, just where the middle favor, just where the rich, and then the middle and poor favor rich and poor and rich and middle. And the first thing you'll notice going in the second, third, and fourth rows is that you get the poor by themselves a good amount of the time. You get the rich by themselves a good amount of the time. The middle are less likely by themselves, which I think is fairly intuitive. When the poor are by themselves, they do about as well as when none of the groups are in favor. And this is kind of the flip side to what Ben was pointing out. It's not only interesting to see what happens when all the groups are in favor, right, which is the bottom here, right, 40%. It's also interesting what happens when none of them are in favor. This is misrepresentation as well, right? Here we have 24% of the time the policies are passing, right? It's not a univariate, right? Monocausal world, right? That's for sure. No matter how you slice opinion, right? No matter who you're picking, right? Because you've got here, the rich by themselves, they hit at 39%. The middle by themselves hit at 38%, although I admit the ends are really small there. The poor do worse, right? You take the middle and the poor don't do a whole lot better, right? You take the rich and the poor, there's a little bit of a jump up, and the rich in the middle. The ends are not perfect here, but basically you're looking at the poor do worse, right? Than the middle and the rich. And you probably didn't need that table. You saw it right there in the figure by comparison with the earlier figure I showed. So how to end this, okay? Disagreement is not that pervasive, right, between income groups. Even where we find disagreement, it's not that great, right? And where we find disagreement, it doesn't matter that much, right? That said, a 50-50 split, say, between the rich and the middle probably isn't good news for democracy, right? The rich are probably getting more influence there than they quote unquote should. The poor fare less well, but they also don't always lose, which is fascinating, right? Even where they disagree with the middle and the rich, they sometimes win 20% of the time. So, differences in opinion matter, right? What seems more pressing to us on the agenda is one thing I've already mentioned and something else that Ben mentioned that I've hinted at as well. Why is there such broad policy agreement across income groups? What explains this? Does it make sense? And why opinion of all groups, whether the poor, the middle, and the rich, matters so little to policymaking? As it says there, these are subjects for another day. Thank you.